For this first topic, we're going to talk about how we can move from samples to populations. So we've just finished this first half of the course in which we talk about descriptive statistics. If you recall, descriptive statistics, it's about organizing and presenting data, whether it's from some kind of sample, which is a subset of a population, or the entire population, say if you conduct a census. So we look at visualization, tables, and various measures of association. We're now building towards inferential statistics. This is about making conclusions about a population based only on data from a subset of that population, or a sample. It's the same thing. A sample is just a subset of a population. So the idea is that we actually don't observe the population, but we can use the sample to make inferences, to say something about that population. So just to remind you, descriptive statistics is about presenting data, so in terms of tables or graphs. So here we have a scatter plot and a bar graph. But it's also about summarizing data. For example, you might look at the average height of respondents in a particular sample. So you just might calculate the mean of that sample. Or you might look at a proportion or percentage, for example, of an entire country based on a census. But the idea is, whether you have a sample or a population, you're just presenting and summarizing the data. Inferential statistics, it's really about two main topics. First of all, estimation. So you might use the average height from a sample to estimate, to have really a best guess for the average height in a population, which you actually don't observe because you just have that sample. Or you might test a claim about that population. For example, you might use a sample of data to test the claim that maybe somebody's making this claim that the average height in a population is 72 inches. Well, you gather your sample and you test that claim. So inferential statistics is really about estimation and hypothesis testing. And we're going to cover both of those topics as we go through the semester. Also, just to remind you, there's this distinction we make between sample statistics and population parameters. So a statistic, it's a numerical summary, but it's based on a sample. So you might say you gather a sample of people living in Japan and you calculate the average annual income. Right? That is a sample statistic. A parameter or population parameter, it's a numerical summary of a population. So you might take the mean annual income of all people living in Japan. So everybody living in Japan, that's your population. We like to distinguish between sample size and population size. A lot of statistics, it's about, in terms of notation, it's about keeping track of samples versus populations. We want to make sure, are we dealing with a population or are we dealing with a sample? So if your data set, if it's based on a sample or subset of a population, we use lowercase n to denote the number of observational units or cases, the number of rows of your data set. If we have data based on an entire population, the number of cases or observational units is based on, or it's denoted by capital N. So capital N, if you have a population, that's the number of rows. As well, just to remind you, in general, not always, but in general, sample statistics, those numerical summaries for a sample, those are referred to using Latin or Roman letters. So for example, the average of a sample, the sample mean, it's denoted by X bar. So we have this X with this little bar over it. In contrast with population parameters, again, usually, but not always, we use Greek letters. So for example, the average of a population, we use Greek letter mu, right? So just to keep track of sample statistics versus population parameters. Again, also, for this part of the course, you might ask, well, why don't we just collect population parameters? Well, it's often very difficult and expensive to actually gather all the data from a population, especially if that population's very large. As well, certain hard-to-reach groups might be very difficult to obtain information on, such as homeless people or undocumented migrants. So even if you're able to collect data from a population in terms of 90% of the population, that last 10% might be very expensive. It can be quite difficult to obtain all the observational units and all the information about all the observational units in a population. As well, there are, of course, ethical concerns, because when you conduct a census, when you gather information from the entire population, everyone has to participate. Right? And that can really raise ethical concerns. What if somebody doesn't want to participate in your study? What if they don't want information collected on them? Well, when you conduct a census, you have to. When you calculate a population parameter, it's based on everything in the population, all people, all elements in that population. As well, it might constitute a violation of one's privacy. So, if you ask everybody personal questions, it might be against their ethics or their personal sense of privacy and integrity. So we often collect samples. And so when we talk about inferential statistics, the idea is we have a population, which we denote with capital N in terms of the number of elements in that population. And we want to gather a sample, a subset of that population, which we denote in terms of the number of elements with lowercase n. And that's what inferential statistics is really about. It's about taking a subset of a population and then using that sample to say something about that population. So the question is, how do we take samples? How do we take a subset of a population? The idea behind inferential statistics is that we want samples that are representative of the population. So if you're looking at heights, of a population, and you want to gather a sample that is more or less representative of the heights in that population. You don't want people who are really short or people who are really tall. You want people who are representative. So on average, similar to that of the population for your sample. The idea is that we're going to randomly select elements from the population. So this process of random selection is very important for making inferential claims about that population. The idea is that all those elements in the population, we call that a sampling frame. So elements in the social sciences are typically individuals. And then the sampling frame is a list of all the individuals from which you sample from. So for example, if you're looking at, say, height in a population, all those elements are individuals. And then in terms of the sampling frame, it might be all the households in a particular city, if that's your population, and you're going to randomly sample from that list, from that sampling frame, when you actually collect your sample. And then the other point to make is that when we talk about a sampling method is a process or procedure for selecting elements from a population using this sampling frame. So we're going to talk about 4 sampling methods. These are not the only sampling methods you'll encounter, but they're very common. So first, we're going to talk about simple random sampling. This is probably the most intuitive for most people. It's the most common. It's the most straightforward. But it has some problems. And there are reasons why people have used other sampling methods. We're going to talk about stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and then a related version of cluster sampling, which is sometimes called multistage sampling. For this course, unless otherwise stated, we're going to focus on simple random sampling. But it's important to cover these other methods because you will see them a lot in applied research and in studies in a variety of fields. So simple random sampling, what is it? Well, suppose we have a population, and that population has capital N equals 100 elements. So if we're talking about individuals, we have 100 individuals, 100 elements. And the idea is we want to select a sample of 18 of those elements, 18 individuals, which we denote with lowercase n. So how do we do this? Well, we just randomly select individuals from the population. The important point about simple random sampling is that each individual in that population, they're equally likely to be sampled. So each time we draw a person from that population, that person is just equally likely to be sampled as any other person. As a consequence of this, we can say that the observational units, each case, they're considered independent of each other. Okay, so knowing that person A was randomly selected from the population, it won't tell you whether person B is going to be randomly selected. There's no kind of dependency. So this is what simple random sampling looks like. All those blue dots, those are all the elements in the population, including those red dots. And then those red dots are those cases that have been randomly selected. That's our sample. Now, there are pros and cons of simple random sampling. The pros, first of all, it's a simple sampling procedure. Okay, so it's straightforward. You just have a sampling frame of all the elements in the population, and you just randomly select those elements based on whatever sample size you want. The other benefit of simple random sampling is that you don't need to know much about the population. You need that sampling frame. Besides that, you don't need to know who's hanging out with whom. You don't need to know how people are clustered. You don't need to know anything about the geography. You don't need to know anything about their social networks. All you need is that sampling frame, and you take random samples, and that's it. You got a representative sample. There are some costs or cons. First of all, you need that sampling frame. You need that list of all elements in the population. And that can be fairly difficult to obtain. It might be expensive to obtain. The other issue is that there's just this issue of cost. Okay, you need this sampling frame, and it might be expensive to obtain that sampling frame. Not everybody may have an address. You might miss some addresses. So there are some benefits and there's some costs. A different sampling method that you will encounter in applied research and studies is something called stratified sampling. So again, suppose we have this population of 100 people, and we want to select a sample of 18 individuals. That's our subset. Well, then what we do is, for this kind of procedure, we're going to divide all these elements, all these individuals, into 6 strata, which we sometimes denote as S. And the idea is that we randomly sample elements within each of these strata, or strata. What are strata? Well, they're groups, and they're usually of substantive interest to the researcher. So for example, you might have 6 different racial or ethnic groups. They might be sports teams if you're randomly sampling sports players. They might be private firms if you're randomly sampling workers, and so on. The whole point is that you have this sampling frame and you divide these elements into 6 different strata or groups. Right? Then you randomly sample within each strata. The idea, though, or rather the point behind this is that each element, each individual, you can only be a member of one strata. So you can't be a member of 2 ethnic groups. You can't be a member of 2 teams or 2 organizations. That's sort of a requirement for this sampling procedure, the way it's set up. So this is what stratified sampling looks like. So we have these 6 different strata. So we have our population, we have our sampling frame, and we divide the sampling frame into these 6 groups. Right? Then within each of those groups, we select, right, a certain number of cases or observational units. So for this particular example, you can see that we've selected 3 elements, 3 individuals for each group or each strata. Importantly, these 6 groups, they are usually of substantive interest. And if you notice, individuals can only be a member of 1. Okay? You only can be a member of 1 strata. All right. There are pros and cons of this sampling procedure. So one positive aspect is that you can ensure that you analyze groups with small proportions in the population. So suppose you look at companies, at private firms. Okay? If you divide the sampling frame into 3 strata, you might have one for a large corporation, another one for another large corporation, and then that 3rd strata, that might be a tiny company. Maybe it only has 50 people, and the other 2 companies have 10,000 people. The idea is that if you just collected a simple random sample, you're going to not gather very many elements from that small company. But with stratified sampling, because you're requiring that you have the same number of elements selected from each group, you're going to have a higher proportion for that smaller group. And so you can say something, you can analyze based on this smaller group that you might actually miss if you have a simple random sample, just because you wouldn't actually gather hardly any elements from that smaller company. Another benefit is that besides being able to make comparisons for some groups that might have very small proportions of population, one benefit is that there's not much difference between samples. So if you repeat the process and collect samples again and again, the samples, the successive samples, they're not going to be that different from each other as compared to a simple random sampling procedure. There are some cons, though. First of all, again, you need to list all the elements of the population, but you also need to have in that sampling frame whether or not these elements are members of different strata. And that is a cost. okay? Because not only do you need a sampling frame, but you need to know something about the population. You need to know that, to use this example of these 3 companies, you need to know that people are working for large company A, large company B, or this tiny company C. You need to know that information. That can be an additional cost. As well, because of the hierarchy, the structure of the sampling procedure, there might be more administrative work because you need to randomly select within these different groups. So for example, instead of just with a simple random sampling procedure, you just randomly sample from that one list. But if you have like 3 companies and you randomly select within each company, well, that might require a little bit more administrative cost because you have to go into company A, go into company B, and then go into company C to randomly select each of these samples. As well, with stratified sampling, when you do your analysis, you actually have to do a little bit of weighting afterwards using sampling weights, and that can be a little bit more difficult in terms of the computation. A different approach for sampling is something called one-stage cluster sampling. Sometimes it's just called cluster sampling. So again, suppose we have 100 elements, and we want to select a sample, a representative sample, of 18 of those 100 elements. Well, in this case, we also determine that there are 9 clusters. So we look at the population, we say, oh, I think there are 9 clusters. Well, what are clusters? Well, they're groups as well, just like strata, but they are not necessarily substantively important. They are naturally occurring clusters that aid in the process of selecting a sample. So these clusters might be neighborhoods. So you might look at different neighborhoods within a city. You might look at different cities. They might be different countries. They might be geographic boundaries. The point is that these are generally naturally occurring clusters. And again, as with strata sampling, each element, they could be a member of only one of these clusters. So you can't, according to the sampling procedure, you can't be a member of Chicago and New York. You only can be a member of Chicago and not New York. The difference between strata and clusters, they're both groups, but in the sense that both non-overlapping subsets. Okay? So each element can be a member of only one strata or one cluster. But they're different in 2 main respects. So first of all strata are represented in the sample, but only a subset of the clusters are actually used in the sample. This is because with cluster sampling, the idea is we want to use these natural clusters to make the sampling process a little bit easier, a little bit less cost intensive. As well, the difference between strata and cluster sampling procedures is that with stratified sampling, it really works best when all these individuals within each stratum, when these elements are homogeneous, okay? So if you have internally homogeneous strata, that is when strata sampling works best. In contrast, with cluster sampling, it really works best when you have a lot of variation, when you have heterogeneity within each cluster. So with strata, within each stratum, you want homogeneity, whereas with cluster sampling, within each cluster, you want heterogeneity. So we'll look at this in just a little bit. But here's one-stage cluster sampling. So what we do is we use some kind of naturally occurring division in the population. For example, we might use geography. Okay, that's quite commonly used. And so if we have, say, 9 different cities that we want to sample from, we just randomly select 3 of those 9 cities or clusters, and we sample everything within each of those clusters. And then those 6 other clusters we don't look at. The idea behind one-stage cluster sampling is that we save time and money because we don't have to look at the entire population. We just have to really understand those 3 clusters, those 3 particular cities. So cluster 3 might be New York, cluster 4 might be Cleveland, Ohio, and cluster 8 rather, might be Boston, Massachusetts. The point is you just collect information from those 3 clusters and not the other 6. And it's called one-stage cluster sampling because there's just one stage. You just randomly select from these clusters, and so out of these 9 clusters, you randomly select 3. That's it in terms of randomization. Then you collect everybody, or all the elements within each of those clusters. So there are a couple pros and cons with one-stage cluster sampling. The benefit and why people use cluster sampling is that it saves time and money. Instead of knowing about collecting elements from all 9 of those clusters, you just collect information on 3 of those 9 clusters. Everybody or all those elements within those 3 clusters, but it does save time and money. The other benefit is that you really only need to know about part of the overall population, okay? Because you only need to know about those 3 clusters, not all 9 clusters, because these samples are only based on those 3 particular clusters. There are a couple cons. One drawback is that there tends to be greater variation between successive samples. So if you repeat the process, using one-stage cluster sampling, you collect another sample from the population of the same size. Okay, those samples are going to bounce around a lot, and in general, we don't prefer a lot of sampling variability. We want a little bit less sampling variability. We want less variation between samples. Another issue is that you might need larger samples if you want to say something meaningful about the population. Sometimes one-stage cluster sampling, it requires a larger set of samples. A related technique is multi-stage cluster sampling. So again, suppose we want to select 18 individuals from a population of 100. And again, suppose there are 9 clusters. So we have 9 different cities, for example. These are naturally occurring groups. Well, this is multi-stage, okay? It was before just one stage, we just randomly selected clusters. Well, now, with multi-stage cluster sampling, we're going to randomly select the clusters, and then within each cluster, we're going to randomly select elements. So this is what multi-stage cluster sampling looks like. So we take those 9 clusters, we randomly select, say, 3 of those 9 clusters, and then within each of those clusters, we don't select all the elements, but we select a random subset of those clusters. So in this case, you can see with clusters 3, 4, and 8, we're only selecting a random subset of each of those clusters. That's why it's called multi-stage. In this case, you have 2 stages. First, randomly select the clusters. Then within each cluster, you randomly select elements within each of those clusters that was selected. Again, this saves time and money. This is why we do cluster sampling. It's less costly than simple random sampling, or even sampling based on strata. Another benefit, again, is that you only need to know about part of the overall population. Just those clusters that we actually sampled that you really need to know about. There are a couple cons, though. And again, this is related to just one-stage cluster sampling. There tends to be greater variation between successive samples. You may need larger samples to say something about the population. And in contrast to one-stage cluster sampling, there's this additional layer of complexity because you have 2 stages in this case. You have to randomly select the clusters, and then within each cluster, you have to randomly select elements. So that adds an additional administrative cost to the sampling procedure. Besides these 4 sampling procedures, another issue when you collect a sample from a population with the goal of obtaining a representative sample is whether you should collect a sample with or without replacement. So the idea is that if you sample with replacement, you select an element and then put that element back in the population. So if you're randomly selecting individuals from a population with replacement, the idea is intuitively you select a person, okay, gather the information, you might gather their height, and then throw them back in the population, then randomly select another person, record his or her height, and throw that person back in the population. And you gather your sample that way. Without replacement, you select an element, but you don't put that element back in the population. So, for example, if we're looking at height, you might randomly select a person from a population, record his or her height, but then you keep that person off to the side. And then you randomly select another person. But the idea is that you avoid selecting any member of the population more than once when you have a random sampling procedure without replacement. We typically, in terms of without versus with replacement, unless otherwise stated, we're going to sample without replacement. So that's kind of the default position for this course. but on occasion we will also sample with replacement, especially if our population is rather small and we want to say something about the sampling distribution, which we'll talk to in just a bit. So that's the key point. All right. The idea behind simple random samples versus these other procedures is that when you have stratified one-stage or multi-stage sampling procedures, conceptually, the idea is the same as with simple random sampling. Right? What you're doing is you're trying to use this process of randomization to gather a representative subset of the population. Right? There's this complexity with these other techniques that you have to adjust your results with what we call sampling or probability weights. That's because of the hierarchical structure of multi-stage and cluster and in one stage and stratified sampling procedures, there are dependencies. So we have to adjust with sampling probability weights. That adds a different layer of complexity. So for this course, we're really going to focus on simple random samples without replacement unless otherwise stated. And so with that, we're going to take a moment to review these materials, and then we're going to try gathering some of our own samples.